I have never heard that medley, Scott. That was amazing. That is a really an awesome way to prepare our minds for the Lord's Supper. If you want to open your Bibles to Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. Isaiah 52 and 53. And I have some slides up. I don't know. Okay. You can just clean it off afterwards. Let me get there real quick. So, we often read Isaiah, a passage like Isaiah 53, before we partake of the Lord's Supper. In Isaiah 53, and preparing for this, I was looking at this passage, and I was noticing in Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 1, Isaiah asks this question, and he says, "To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" And I got to thinking, what exactly does Isaiah mean, or what could he mean by this? And as I started investigating that a little bit more, it became apparent that maybe the most likely explanation is the following, that throughout Scripture, we see the metaphor of God's outstretched arm, particularly in the Old Testament. It's where we see it the most. And this metaphor most often alludes to salvation or redemption, specifically. Moses makes mention, I'm not going to mention all the places that it's mentioned, but Moses makes mention of this idea of God's outstretched arm or mighty hand in Deuteronomy several times when he's conveying to the people their responsibility now to follow the law because of God's outstretched arm. Deuteronomy 4:35, 26:8 are two examples of that. Jeremiah also makes mention of God's salvation and outstretched arm in his prayer of Jeremiah 32:21. So this illustration of an outstretched arm is all throughout the Old Testament. So what we see in Isaiah 52 and 53 is really Isaiah painting a picture, and this is how, in defining this, I guess I should say, it kind of helped me see this passage a little bit differently. Not drastically differently, but it kind of paints a different picture for me. And that is the idea of God's saving arm through his chosen servant, Jesus. And really, Isaiah alludes to this in 52 verse 10, when he says that the Lord will lay bare his holy arm in the sight of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. So he's kind of ramping up to this climax of Isaiah 53 in chapter 52. It says God is going to lay bare his arm. He's going to outstretch his arm, and all the nations are going to see it. They're going to see the salvation of our God. So he starts making mention of this idea of God's outstretched arm here in chapter 52, and he lays forth this question then in 53, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So with that in mind, I want us to really kind of walk through 52 and 53 here and really take a look at God's saving arm, his outstretched arm together. So let's back up. I have, most of these passages are the NIV, just like the way it reads. But this first passage, 13 through 15, is the New English Translation. And I just wanted to give us an idea of how some other versions read. I don't think anybody here would necessarily conclude that the New English Translation is an exact word-for-word translation, but it is a good, I think, common English way of saying some of the things that he's conveying here. So he says here, "Look, my servant will succeed. He will be elevated, lifted high, and greatly exalted. Just as many were horrified by the sight of you, he was so disfigured, he no longer looked like a man. His form was so marred, he no longer looked human. So now he will startle many nations. Kings will be shocked by his exaltation, for they will witness something unannounced to them, and they will understand something they had not heard about." Really, the idea that Isaiah is presenting in Isaiah 52 and 53 is that no one would have ever predicted God's saving arm as seen in Jesus. No one would have guessed that. And that's what he's saying here. His form was so disfigured, he didn't even look like a man. His form was so marred, he no longer looked human. And people were in silence because of this. He says kings will be shocked by his exaltation, but in the New American Standard, it says kings will shut their mouths on account of him. No one would have ever predicted the saving of the arm of God as seen through Jesus. Who would have guessed that God's chosen servant, his chosen redeemer, we might use that word, which is exactly what Isaiah is describing here in 52 and 53. Who would have guessed that God's chosen redeemer would redeem his people in silence, disfigurement, and ultimately shame? No one. When we gaze upon the salvation offered through Jesus, offered through this servant, I think when we really dig into this, we're in awe, aren't we? We're in awe. And it brings us to ultimately silence. Humbles us. I think Paul had that same, you can almost feel Paul feeling this in Romans chapter 11 when he's talking about everything that God has done and his grace. And he says, who can understand God's ways? Behold the wisdom of God. And he just goes into this praise of God. It just leaves us in awe. And that's the picture that Isaiah is trying to paint for us here in Isaiah 52 and 53. That this suffering servant, no one would have guessed it. And it ultimately leaves us in silence. But the picture, I'll say this, that Isaiah continues to paint going into chapter 53, which we're all quite familiar with, he poses a question with it. And he says, who will believe our report? Who's going to believe this? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Who's going to see salvation in this Jesus? So think about that as we walk through the rest of this text. As we continue through Isaiah 53, I'll say it like this. Isaiah describes the unbelievable nature of God's chosen servant, which is why he asks this question in 53 and verse 1. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? There are few who will look upon, particularly at the time of Jesus, those who were actually there for his crucifixion, there are few who are going to look upon this disfigured, unrecognizable, despised, and ultimately dying criminal, is how they viewed him, and believe that this was God's outstretched arm, that this was God's salvation. So, Isaiah asks this question, who's going to believe our report? And he continues in verses 2 through 3 to describe why some people aren't going to believe it. And that's when he says, again, this is the NIV, he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. So he's really describing why some of these people aren't ultimately going to believe in Jesus, because he didn't have the appearance of some great king, like Saul, for example, standing head and shoulders above everyone else, good looking. That wasn't Jesus. In fact, he's actually dying the death of a criminal. No one is there to support him. No one's there to back Jesus. He's by himself. Who would look at Jesus and say, that's got to be God's saving arm? And he even says at the end of verse 4, we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. Who wouldn't walk by the cross at the time of Jesus' crucifixion and think, that guy is not a criminal, he's God's salvation, he's God's redeemer. So by human standards, Jesus ultimately was nothing special, and most wouldn't pay any special attention to him. But here's the point that I'm getting at for the Lord's Supper, and that is that it is those who choose to believe in Jesus, those of us who are here today who do believe in Jesus, that recognize in this Redeemer, this suffering servant, the revealed and saving arm of God. And so Isaiah continues to paint this picture of salvation through Jesus, going on throughout the text. And we'll skip over verses 4 and 5 for now and jump to 6 and 7, because I like this this idea that this picture that Isaiah paints in contrast, really. And the contrast that he's using is our sheep-like nature contrasted with the sheep-like nature of Jesus. Our sheep-like nature is all the bad qualities of a sheep, isn't it? But Jesus' sheep-like nature is the very thing that ultimately redeems us. Our stupidity leads us to wander away. We've all turned aside, is what he says. We've all turned aside. We've all wandered away. But Jesus, like a lamb being led to the slaughterhouse in silence, suffers ultimately for our wanderings. It's really kind of an incredible thing, isn't it? It just leaves you in awe of what God has done through this lamb for us. It's a powerful picture of a meek and gentle and silent lamb suffering ultimately for his senseless counterparts, you and me. So again, I want to emphasize that Isaiah is really painting a picture of the unbelievable nature of the outstretched arm of God. God, this is God laying bare his arm, as he said in chapter 52 and verse 10. Who's going to believe it? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Ultimately, Isaiah concludes his description in verses 10 through 12. He says that it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. What's most astounding, perhaps, about this saving arm, the suffering servant, is that this was Yahweh's will all along. It was the will of the Lord to crush him, to cause him to suffer. The Father had plans through his servant's suffering that ultimately led to, as he describes here, our justification and our intercession. And then again, ultimately, to Jesus' glorification in verse 12. So Isaiah paints what we might call an unbelievable picture of God's outstretched arm as seen in Jesus. And I just want to conclude by saying that today we assemble to acknowledge our belief that God has revealed his saving arm through Jesus. Isaiah is posing this question for everyone, all readers, right? Ultimately, who's going to believe this report? Who's going to believe it? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Well, it's been revealed to you and me. And this morning, we acknowledge that. We look at the suffering servant described here in chapter 53, and we don't scoff at him, but we say, we realize and recognize the intercession that we now have, as he says here in verse 12. We realize that now our iniquities are taken away. And as we'll read here in verses 4 and 5, we realize that Jesus has given us freedom ultimately from eternal consequence. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. He gives us freedom from being punished, right? He was stricken and afflicted for us. He was crushed for our iniquities. He gives us peace and reconciliation with God. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And ultimately, he gives us healing. By his wounds, we are healed. And then verse 12, he said, he made intercession for the transgressors. That's what we come here this morning to remember. When we read Isaiah 53, we believe. We put our hope that this suffering servant, that this outstretched arm of God that Isaiah is describing is for you and for me. It's for us. I want to read one more passage in Deuteronomy 5, verse 15. It says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Today, we, like the Israelites of old, we've been commanded to observe the Lord's day. Very similarly, what were they to remember? Outstretched arm of God. This morning, we too remember the outstretched arm of God as seen in Jesus. In this, we remember that we too were slaves, and that God's saving arm has brought us out through Jesus. It's by faith, right? It's by faith we remember his silent suffering as a lamb to the slaughter because of our wanderings. By faith we remember his suffering that brings us peace and healing, reconciliation, and intercession. And ultimately, by faith, we, like the kings of Isaiah 52:15, we sit in awe, we sit in silence as we remember Jesus this morning. We sit in awe and silence at the saving arm of God. Let's give thanks for the bread.